Okay, let's see. Mary Kay, you're here. Randy, you're there.
Good.
Just so we don't have visual cognitive dissonance. Well, good morning and welcome to the Shanker Institute's conference on the crisis of democracy. I've been here before talking about the crisis of unions, and it occurs to me that there are some distinct overlaps here. It seems to me that the last several decades there has been a general weakening of union strength throughout the industrial and post-industrial world, and that the crisis of democracy seems to have followed upon that, which suggests that there are some common causes: the weakening of the state, with the growth of globalization, which is one of the factors listed on a handout which you should all have, which Mary Kay prepared. So today, this morning, we're going to begin with a discussion from two of the, in both senses of the word, class acts from American labor leadership. I don't think they really need an extensive introduction. To my immediate left, Mary Kay Henry, the president of SEIU, one of the most dynamic unions, not just today, but in the history of the American labor movement, which has led the Fight for 15, which has caused a lot of low-wage workers to be not quite so low-wage as they have been. And to Mary Kay's left, the president of the American Federation of Teachers and the president of the Albert Shanker Institute, so in a sense our host, Randi Weingarten, who is not only...
Okay, we spent a lot of time together.
Okay. You want those? Randi was not only at some point a legal counselor for the AFT, but also a civics teacher, teaching the fundamentals of democracy in New York City schools, something that we would probably think in the course of this discussion is the kind of thing that the United States as a whole needs more of. So, welcome to both of you, and yes.
And thank you, Harold. And thank you, Harold, for moderating.
Okay, well, it's a pleasure. Let's get started with this. It is no secret that not only is there a general crisis in American unionism, but that there's some specific crises facing public sector unions, of which SEIU and AFT are among the top tier. And you both are going to be dealing with some very difficult issues, simply in organizational maintenance and trying to keep on doing the stuff you have been doing. But you're gonna, there will be some people who say we've got to circle the wagons, and this extensive agenda of democracy promotion isn't really the sort of stuff we should be involved in. So what do you say to your members if they say that? How do you justify the broader concerns that both of your unions have completely exemplified?
So there's the 2-second answer, and then there's the several paragraphs answer.
Well, several paragraphs.
Okay, so the several paragraphs answer, actually, I know this sounds a little silly, but in some ways, the best advocacy I find is rooted in the rules and the lessons I learned being a classroom teacher, which is, number one, meet people where they are and try to bring them to where you want them to be, but you have to meet them where they are. And secondly, it's not what is said, it is what is heard. And so when I say meet people where they are, our members get, there's two things. all of our members, not just the K-12 social studies teachers, all of our members get that a voice at work is really important. And if a voice at work is really important, the only way you enable a voice at work is if you actually have a voice in your nation and in your democracy, or in your nation. And the only way you have a voice in your nation is if you actually respect dissent and respect the infrastructure of democracy and nurture that infrastructure of democracy. And Mary Kay, I think, put together a whole bunch of good ideas which nurtures the infrastructure of democracy, including an independent media, a real judiciary, the integrity of the voting process. You know, we should be actually promoting voting as opposed to having to fight voter suppression. But there, you know, so it's not just the checks and balances of, you know, this is the executive power, this is the legislative power. Right. But it really starts with the through line from voice and what constitutes meaningful voice and what enables dissent. And so that is, you know, I think that's the through line for every union. For ours in particular, because we are school teachers, yes, we are nurses and healthcare providers, but we are early childhood to college school teachers. And foundationally, public education and democracy go hand in hand. Public education is foundational to democracy. And without public education, you cannot nurture, in my judgment, democratic principles and practices. And that is part of the reason why in AFT speak, you know, from Shanker used to say, I think, Shanker used to say, democracy in education, education for democracy. And he used to try to create that circle. And the last thing is that, again, it goes back to, it's not what you say, it's what's heard, and it's not where you start, it's in some ways where you end. We at the AFT, since the election, have really focused on 5 values, 5 pillars. And the first being economic security, a voice at work, secure retirement, living wages, but, you know, good health care, public education. But then the 4th and the 5th value are pluralism and democracy, and the 5th value is the fight against bigotry and hate. And so in every speech I give and every time I talk to people in our union across the country, I talk about those 5 values, and you constantly see the shaking of the heads and the engagement around that. So it's, you know, it's actually practicing what you're preaching, the fundamental of connecting what we do as a union to why democracy is important.
Okay. Mary Kay, you have a union that is very occupationally diverse, ranging from lots of folks in healthcare to public employees across the board to the janitorial workforces in the downtowns of many cities. So it's quite a diverse membership. And how do you engage your members in these broader fights? What's the through line? What's your message to your members on questions of democracy in this day and age?
The other thing about our members that I was talking to Mary Catherine about from Minnesota Education Association is the point Randy just made. Our members' children are the students of AFT members around this country, and so we really think of our destinies as linked, and it's why I'm so proud to be a partner with the AFT and thrilled that the Shanker Institute is creating this space for this discussion, because I think part of our job in this period of crisis for the escalation of the attack on working people is to help people understand that without a free and independent trade union movement, we can't have can't have a fight over the direction of our democracy. It was one of the reasons why I thought, I'm not sure that this chart that I saw at a seminar in February actually speaks to the points that I've heard Randy and I want to make, because I would add a fully funded, completely integrated and equal public education system as vital to our democracy as well. Which is a fight our members very much want to join. But to your point, the beauty of unions, in my experience, is that it creates a set of relationships that you can't have anywhere else in American civil society at this moment. Because we are so segregated from each other in our churches, in our housing, in our, that our work and our advocacy organization makes us come together and have to understand each other's lives. So the beauty of that diversity, from my perspective, is a way that we are trying to help our members from every walk of life. The white conservative in Michigan, corrections officer who felt like primarily he, there's 10% that are she, had no other choice but to either become a corrections officer or to leave their home in order to fend for themselves and their families. And how that person's situation is similar to our African American home care and nursing home workers, and how those two are connected to the Muslim American who's terrified because of the ban, on and on and on. So I think the thing that there's three things we're trying to do that avoid circling the wagons and that are centered in how do we help each working person understand that it's in their self-interest to join these broader fights and redefine the role of the union from simply wage and benefit protection to a civic organization that is going to fight for justice on every front. And those fights for justice, whether they directly impact me and my family, have to be won in order for me and my family to do better. And connecting those dots and making the case is what we're obsessed with right now. And there's three ways we're trying to do it. One is through a member campaign that I know AFT, AFSCME, NEA, many other parts of the labor movement are recommitting our members to their organization. And in our case, we're trying to do it through an education, organizing, leadership empowerment campaign that also redefines the purpose of what I'm committing to as people sign their membership card, and then also authorize us to direct join mechanism. So it's an internal organizing campaign where between now and March, we're trying to figure out 7 different ways in which we engage those members in some fight for justice, whether it's racial justice, depending on what's happening in their city or geography, on felon reenfranchisement, bail reform for the criminal justice system, whatever, or immigrant justice, which is in our face at the moment as it relates to the DREAM Act and the expiration of temporary protected status for El Salvadorans, Hondurans, and Haitians in the next 4 months. Or environmental justice, which is in our face in Texas, Puerto Rico, Florida, and connecting those ways for people to see their union as a way to address what feels to many families in this nation now as an escalating crisis. And then the second thing we're trying to do is protect and expand the resources we're committing to non-union workers in joining our union members in that fight for justice. And so we're trying to open up bigger organizing campaigns than we've done in the last 10 years, which, as you can imagine, is a little counterintuitive as we're reducing current resource.
Yeah.
But people see it in our that's how workers won unions as we were born 100 years ago, and we think it's how workers will prevail in this moment. So we're trying to drive the conversation about, as loud as 15 has become, can we join and make a standard that workers have to join unions in order to protect our democracy as something that we punctuate in the 18 midterm, the 20 presidential, the 22 and beyond. And then the third thing we're trying to make the case on with our members is we can't do this by ourselves. And what is it that we're going to do differently to join with other, the rest of the labor movement makes sense to people because it's their lived experience in a lot of communities. But how we as labor come as equals to a table of environmental, LGBTQ, racial justice, the historic civil rights, the women's movement, et cetera, as equals, even when we have more resources than the rest of the ecosystem, is something we're trying to train and practice ourselves to do at the city and state level. And there's great examples. We think Minnesota is a good example of how the trade union movement has figured out how to be partners of equal, even when the resources of the other organizations aren't the same. And they've had a pattern of winning on fights when they join together that we can point to and make as the self-interest of our members. So those are the three ways that we are helping our members learn that circling the wagons, while it feels like the right instinct, isn't the way to win or to realize our vision for justice in this country.
Thanks.
Let me just,
sure.
because I think our unions have very similar strategies of engagement, even in a period of time when you would expect us to be reducing funding in those areas. People within the AFT, whether they understand that member engagement and community involvement go hand in hand. So, for example, we have not cut our commitment, we've shaved it a tiny bit, but we've not cut our commitment to the community engagement that we're doing. And every bit of, and in fact, the focus in terms of the multiple pathways of engagement, because the members have to see themselves in the advocacy. They see themselves in the advocacy, then there is real engagement, because there is power in collective advocacy, but people don't talk that way. And people don't think about it that way. They think about it much more. Mary Kay talks about self-interest. People have to see themselves. They have to see their interest in it. So we keep saying we have to make sure, we have to find ways and pathways that the members see themselves in the advocacy. And some of them will see it in social justice, and some of them will see it in community involvement. But it all comes under an umbrella that we fight. We don't just resist. We fight for a better life for people. So we fight against things and we fight for things. And underlying that, in the union movement of today, we care deeply, not just about each other, but about our communities. So that both of us are finding ways of engagement, not just with the muscle and not just with the head, which is what our union used to do really, really well, but with the heart. And so and you can see it in, we may use different words, but you're seeing that kind of engagement, and AFSCME is doing the same, and NEA is doing the same.
My friend Ron Brownstein, who has a talking head role at CNN, was able to get a breakdown of the network exit polls from the last election on union members by race. And when it got to white union members, it was not a notably pretty picture. I don't think your unions, in terms of voting habits, I'm just hypothesizing, reflect by any means the most problematic aspects of that. I suspect you guys had unions which were, in which the percentage of union members voting for Trump was a good deal smaller than might have been the case in some other unions. But how do you deal with that? How do you deal, Mary Kay, with the white corrections officer as you are talking about involvement in social causes which may not be the sort of thing he's hearing about if the radio is turned to Limbo or the TV is turned to Fox News?
Right. Well, we made a decision as a union to try and begin a journey that our Secretary-Treasurer, Jerry Hudson, has led for the past, since 2014. We did a 2-year dialogue that was multiracial in our union, and at the same time repurposed our Republican Member Advisory Committee to a conservative committee because many were dissatisfied with the party affiliation but wanted to be understood as conservative and wanted to adopt the union's ultimate position that we did at the 16 convention, which is that our union was going to begin a education and empowerment process on what does it mean to stand against anti-Black structural racism and why is it required for every leader and member in the union to understand that it wasn't about what we were doing for the Black community or our Black brothers and sisters in our union, but it was how we were standing up for our own humanity, our own economic self-interest, our own. And so I think the biggest thing, Harold, that we're trying to do is slow down a little bit and listen to each other. Because the work that just on the, we have white men and women in our union that have the same experience as other parts of the labor movement. In our case, 20% of our members voted for Trump. When we polled the summer before the November election, it was 48% were going to vote for Trump.
Whoa.
So we doubled down on the communication and engagement of those members. So instead of engaging 3 times, which was the program union-wide, we increased resources in engaging our white members and you know, we had a Black and white leader go work site by work site to try and have as uncomfortable and conscious a conversation about what role race was playing in our politic to help our members kind of, and it was seen as the family coming together to have a conversation that wasn't being talked about on Limbaugh, wasn't being talked about so that's what I mean about slowing down. It requires very intentional, structured conversation to help get underneath what we're fed and believe. So that's 1. 2 is, I think that we're trying to figure out as a union, how do we encourage things that will flip the script? So this corrections officer who was part of the doubling down and increasing the engagement is now in a conversation with formerly incarcerated people in prison about how can corrections officers and the formerly incarcerated people from our prison system join together and end mass incarceration. And how can corrections officers and the formerly incarcerated join together and fight for the dignity of everybody behind the wall, is how they talk about it. When we can lift up those kinds of efforts, and they are led by a white worker who thinks that structural racism is the reason why the prison system on his watch flipped from representing the population of Michigan to being all Black and brown. He knows in his guts that's not because more Black and brown people were committing felonies, you know? And he's willing to have a conversation with his white corrections officers about how it's not right, 1. And 2, he's willing to help the corrections officers who are mad about privatized food and forced labor and the cutting of wages of the incarcerated. That is both a dangerous situation for the corrections officer and completely unacceptable for the people that are in. So I think it's trying to figure out how to use the muscle of the union, our organization, to have fights that actually make a difference now, but help us unpack the root of the problem. It's just one example. The other thing I wanted to share is I was demonstrating at the White House with our members demanding the relief for the Puerto Rican debt and the rebuild. And many of our members who are canvassing in Virginia came for this event because they were debriefing their weekend. And I said to this woman, how's it going on the doors in Virginia? And she said, it's been interesting, Mary Kay. And whenever I hear that from one of our...
Freeze.
Yeah,
Dangerous euphemism.
yeah, I said, like, interesting because the racism's in your face. And she said, yeah, a photo was taken of me by the neighborhood association guy. And he told me to get out of the neighborhood. And she said, I've canvassed in Virginia 9 times, 9 years running. This is one of our super MPOs. And so I just looked him dead in the eye and I said, sir, I'm going to take your picture and I want your name because I'm in an organization that has attorneys. And I think what you're saying to me is not right. And she said he backed off. The other member political organizers came. So to me, it was like a little microcosm of the difference empowered leadership that happens in organization makes for what's required of us to turn things around. And she was another example to me of somebody who knows my union stands against racism, and I'm going to be on solid ground if I object. And my organization will back me. And I just think kind of creating that counterpoint to the culture that we're having to wake up in every day, and for white leadership to not wait in rooms where people of color are assumed to have to advocate on it is really, really important. And the union is the vehicle through which we can model it because we are multiracial organizations. And that's the way I think it's like taking a stand, taking action, and then shining a light on the action to help educate people about what can be different.
Randi, you have a multiracial, multi-political tendency organization, I'm
Yeah.
sure. Talk a little about...
No, it's interesting
yeah.
to listen because we've,
You need the
we
mic
have
a
a
little more.
we have a lot of conversations, but to hear the way SEIU has done this work, and we've never actually had this particular conversation, we've done that work in a similar kind of way in that, after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, our Secretary-Treasurer, Loretta Johnson, who was African American, for those who don't know, led what we called our equity task force. And some of us just called it our race task force because we wanted to actually really think about it in that kind of very tangible way. And we ended up having a whole bunch of people from all over the country, lots of new leaders, because the 2 points that Mary Kay said before that I think are really important is there is a very important role for leadership and for nurturing leadership. We talk about it a lot, we don't do it as much as we talk about. And nurturing new leadership and having those kind of validators all across the country is very important. And leadership and listening go side by side with each other, but leaders need to have context, not just sound bites, and have to feel empowered and have to know, regardless of whether they make mistakes or not, they're going to be backed up in a real way if there is a real kind of understanding and shared experience and shared values. And the second point that Mary Kay made that I think is really important that I didn't actually see until you said it, is that in our country has gotten more and more segregated in every single way. One of the only places that we are not completely segregated anymore is in work and in our unions in some ways. And if you think about schools, housing patterns, we are more segregated today than 10 years after Brown v. Board, as you have written. So the question becomes, how do you create, and Guy Cecil yesterday said to us, the head of priorities, that we're also pretty segregated now in social media and in the algorithms around social media. So how do you actually even break through and have a real conversation? You cannot change attitudes and beliefs unless you can engage in real conversation. And then what do you do to sustain and scale that so it's not just the 4 people that had the conversation? And so the way in which we've tried to do it is, so we had the equity report, we had the equity meetings, they were amazing. We had the equity report. Loretta said to me, very plaintively, that I, as a white leader, had more of a role in finding ways to explain white privilege and white bias in a way so that our African American and our Latino and our Native American members could see that I would be willing to go through the conversations myself and champion things myself and model things myself. And that was as important because of being white as anything else. And it was that moment when she said that to me, it was the responsibility is all of ours. And consequently, we went through a lot of this process, and we went through it in a couple of different ways. When we started having hashtags that said Black Lives Matter on tweets and other things that I did, we had several correction and probation members from Montana and Connecticut who had the same conversation that Mary Kay was having with people in Michigan, we were having with people in Connecticut and in Montana. And what we did was we created the same kind of task forces of people who had been and felt, even to today, tremendous discrimination because of color, and the white probationary officers and correction officers, and started having a shared conversation and a shared experience. And then what we did was we brought all of this to the floor of our convention. And it was incredibly meaningful to watch the white probation and correction officer at the same time as the head of our African American caucus get up to microphones together, talking about the resolutions that had been worked out and showing a shared experience and showing a different kind of pathway in terms of how to do things. So it was the conversations, and then also how do we do this on a grander scale so it meant we could get to more people, and then use those resolutions in a meaningful way.
You know, this makes me think of it's not quite a debate, but the discussion going on right now about the substance of American liberalism and Democratic Party politics, in which sometimes you get the counterposed the notion of identity politics and class politics, and as though these were two distinct categories. But this is a real discussion right now in postmortems of the Clinton campaign and in other discussions as well. And it just seems to me, and it seemed to me before, but even more so after hearing the two of you speak, that you folks have, the two of you, and more significantly your unions and the union movement more broadly, has a particular role to play, I think, in pointing out where this discussion should be headed, the notion of false choices, because at your best you embody the way in which American liberalism should encompass these range of concerns, and that they're not counterposed. I'll personally say, on the basis of just having been at the last Democratic National Convention, one of many that I've covered, it would have been great if you'd had a white correctional officer and a former inmate on the podium at the same time. That's, I think, the sort of vision you're pointing to would be exemplary for the liberal cause, broadly speaking, as a whole. Any thoughts about this debate, this discussion?
Well, I'll probably get in trouble for what I'm about to say. It's stupid. It's just ridiculous. You cannot actually, the fight against economic injustice and inequity is a fight against bigotry and hate. I mean, I don't understand how anybody can actually untangle these two things. And I think that it was posed in a New York Times op-ed in a way that Democrats then decided to engage in the debate as opposed to ignore the debate and do the work to make people's lives better. If you are fighting for the fight for 15, if you are fighting for a secure retirement, those are racial fights, those are LGBT fights, those are economic fights. I don't see how you can untangle that. And the moment you do, you walk right into the conservative mousetrap. And so I frankly didn't understand why any Democrats would engage in that fight as opposed to a postmortem of why is it that Trump hijacked our message and people believed him more than they have believed us who have been fighting for a better life for people for how many years? Sorry, it is just, but I mean, the other thing I want to say is, neither one of us make it a secret that, we are not heterosexual, let's put it that way. We both have female partners who we take around to places. People know this about us. You think about the union that Mary Kay is the president of, you think about the union I'm the president of 20 or 30 years ago. Would you have had an openly lesbian president of the American Federation of Teachers, given all of the discussion in this country and the fear of pedophilia, of pedophiles and things like, and the like? So, but we don't wear it on our sleeve. I'm saying it now simply because that is part of who we are. And we have to fight discrimination and bigotry and hate and the obstacles to equality. And that is a really important fight. But the economic fight is the fight that joins everyone.
Randy's story makes me think of the first nursing home campaign that I did as an organizer in 1981 for SEIU. The union buster outed me because he thought it would destroy the committee's trust in me. And I had not come out to the committee, officially. But the committee knew. And we had this very kind of tense and then loving conversation about how they were trying one thing after another, like a really important woman in the laundry had been the organizer, the leader of the workers. And she had been fired, she'd been returned to work, and then they outed me. And so the way, I salute Randy's passion, and I adopt it. Here's what I think about what you said. When I'm with her in rooms, what she and I have to do in order to challenge the current ethos of what I would characterize as the more establishment Democrats is to vigorously disagree with most of the postmortems that are occurring, and then to share the numbers that nobody seems to be willing to look at, because if you look at the numbers, the story is told that to try and separate the way race is being used by extremists to divide us from each other is nonsense. And we have to come to terms with how central that politic is and how important our leadership is in creating a fusion between class, race, gender. There's a whole bunch of things that the extremists have been really good at confusing us about. And I just wanted to share what Jerry does within our union is just break the numbers down in two stories that people in this room know about Wisconsin and Michigan, which for me represent the 40-year escalation of an attack on worker organization. And the use of race to suppress a vote that matters for the people that we need to elect that's going to champion the turnaround. So the union membership was cut in half in Wisconsin between '05 and '15 due to what we all know, right? And then in '14, Wisconsin passed the voter ID law that, as a direct result, turnout was at its lowest level in the last 2 decades. On 70% of the state's black population lives in Milwaukee. Milwaukee alone had a 13% decrease in turnout, and in '16, Clinton lost by 22,000 votes. So this is not rocket science. The opposition is fusing the two issues, and we seem to be debating whether or not we have to respond in kind. And there's a similar set of facts for Michigan. We can say what happened in other pockets of the country. So we reject it, but there's a piece of who we all collectively have to move that aren't going to respond to our indignation and passion,
Right.
but frankly should respond to, do we want to win or not? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And frankly, that's true for our own membership. There's a part of our membership that are the leaders that are willing to be incredibly passionate about our indignation, but we also understand there's a group in the middle that do want to understand how their family is going to be safe and how their kids are going to do better across race. And if we can help them understand how racism is being used to undermine us all, we may not get them to this passion in our lifetime, but we're going to have to, we got to start to turn the tide. You know what I mean?
Mary Kay is totally right.
So I think of it as a organizing campaign. There's 30% of the workers I'm never going to get, and I can't spend my time on them. But can I create enough fusion between workers that are segregated by race, because to think about how are their interests connected and how can we begin to understand each other as brothers and sisters, which for me is the incredible treasure of the union movement. Because I am in relationship to people that I would never have met in my entire life based on how I grew up. And it has made me a richer and better person, and our leaders experience that all the time. And it's why people are willing to be on fire for each other's fights, and why I think we have to be really strategic about what fights we pick and what demands we make so that people can experience winning when they come together. People want to, there's more risk being taken by everyday people, which I think we're all seeing inside our unions and across. People are getting off their couches and into the streets, or if that's not quite what they're interested in, they're getting online and phoning their congressperson and writing letters. Like, there's a whole range of activism that we were built to encourage and help, and that's what I think is our obligation in terms of restoring democracy in this country.
Even the people, we've done a whole bunch of polling on education, and even the people who believe in charters or vouchers do not want money taken from public schools to fund them. And so the challenge is how there is, and I spend more time in what is traditionally viewed as red states these days than in blue states, and communities that voted for Trump then didn't. And what I have seen is what Mary Kay just said. There is a commonality amongst workers that if you actually meet it, like on what I just said about education, people want to be with each other and to work with each other. This fear of the other, that the Republican, and that a conservative movement, that a Koch type movement, that a DeVos type movement has
has exploited in this era is one that is not shared by most of the people that I have met with in the last year, meaning since the last election. And I have an abiding belief and trust that if we are championing issues that people see and feel could get them and their communities to a better life, that is the path not only to winning, but that is the path to righteousness. And that, and so there, what I find, Harold, is that people who want to use race end up injecting the kind of divisiveness into the equation as opposed to having the kind of shared experience. I'm not saying that we don't have an obligation to actually expose racism as it is and try and change hearts and minds. But the class issues in the country, we can actually, I really believe, we can actually join a majority of people. Because the last thing I'll say is, forget about most of those forget about the Trump voters you're never going to turn. Half the people in America didn't vote last time, and many of them didn't vote because they felt, what will it mean? What will it matter? That is a huge group of people that I think if there was an engagement and a sense of empowerment, we could move them to voting for a better life.
The Gallup organization polls every year on the favorability of the union movement among the American public. And the latest poll came out a couple months ago, had it the highest it's been in quite some time. I think 61% viewed unions favorably, which is a higher number than you get for any political figure in this country, possible exception of Bernie Sanders. But in the private sector, only 1/10 of 61%, or a little higher than 1/10 of it, is actually in unions. And so the amount of clout, broadly speaking, that your organizations and the union movement as a whole has to bring to the battles that you both have just outlined and the strategies isn't, is clearly not what it used to be. And even though I think you guys have a sharper focus that addresses a lot of these issues perhaps more clearly than the union movement has in some time, the oomph behind that is under fire and clearly not what it was in the heyday of the post-war period. So is the best way to advocate for the kind of economic issues you're talking about beyond the union? Is it things like the Fight for 15? Do you have to become tribunes for folks who may or may not eventually be part of the union or may never be part of the union? I mean, how do you deal with this problem of advocating on economic issues when the strength is not quite what it was, and how do you, getting back to the original question, justify the involvement in all of these other causes, which you have done here already, again, when your strength is diminished?
So, and look, I want to give props to SEIU and also to the folks who created worker centers and things like that, and really trying to think about where work is right now and how you create power for workers in concerted and collective action. And it's been interesting. We've both been in these conversations with our respective local leaders where, there's always some tension if something new gets formed, and how do you ensure that that is not like a cheap dues outfit or something like that. But I think the answer to your question is, at least from our judgment, we still think power is obtained for regular folks at the bargaining table in the ballot box. We still very much believe that, and with still as battered as it gets, the National Labor Relations Act, the mini PERC acts are very important in terms of creating the right to collectively bargain, which we believe is absolutely essential. Having said that, what about all of those folks these days who are adjunct workers, who are in the gig economy, who are in industries that there is 0% density? And one of the things we're trying to do is we have gone, Lee Saunders, myself, and now joined by many others, we are going into the AFL-CIO convention with a resolution on the future of work and the future of the labor movement, and how we think about these new, these industries where there is virtually no density or where our density is continuously attacked.
And if I may, but also industries where most of the people working aren't even covered under the National Labor Relations Act.
I agree,
Because they
totally.
are not direct full-time employees.
That's,
right.
I mean, we could go through digitization, automation, globalization, deindustrialization, deprofessionalization, and on and on and on. But I think that, SEIU has been ahead of us in thinking through some of that. And I think that we have an obligation to think through how to create collective action and concerted action in many of these different places in order to create power and density in the 21st century, as opposed to having a labor movement that is still kind of sort of moored in the 18th and 19th century.
I was thinking, as you asked, that how do we justify it internally and with our partners is, the only way we can realize our vision for a just society is if we are clear-eyed and sober about the moment we're in. And it's unless our members and our union link arms with the rest of the ecosystem of the progressive movement and think of ourselves not as the 16 million union members that are hanging on, but as the 75 million fighting together to change the direction of the country. That's like the vision we try and project. So that's one. Two is the question that we confront is, I think this is a make or break moment for the current American labor movement. And that's why I think Randi's leadership on trying to drive a question about the future is so critical. But I also think we have to act. And for us, we are not going to engage in any fight that doesn't squarely link racial justice with every other, because we think it's so central to how we shift the politic. It's being used, it's more in our face than, it's more in white people's faces than it's ever been. It's always been in the people of color's faces. And
sure.
So that's one. Two is we think that our members are drawn to a fight on immigration, a fight on criminal justice, a fight on voting rights, a fight on clean air in their community, and how we link those fights in the politic is what we think is key. So what we're trying to figure out is how does the union shrink, which it's going to do in the next 18 months, use what we have to maintain some relationship with former union members and unite the fight with Latino, African American, API, Native people in our communities, because together we have to be the fusion that changes the politics. And so it's not just about 18, it's about what does 18 signal for 20? How does 20 make redrawing the lines possible in 21? How can we paint a picture of national power in 22 and 24 that makes me think, okay, I can suck it up a little bit longer because there's a picture of how I could win and change things. Maybe, and the thing that's amazing to me about the people we both represent is it may not be a change in my life, but I'm going to use my last breath to make a change for the next generation. And that's what fuels the leadership in our union being willing to both take the hits in the short term and hang in to have the fight in the long term. And that's why I think our willingness to unite the fights for justice and here's the thing that we're about to have this debate inside our union. Our getting louder and prouder on these fights for justice is going to mean that some of our current members drop. And the question that we have to figure out is how does that become okay? Because people will see progress and we will then attract. That's going to be the short term. This is starting to bubble up in the one-on-one conversations.
Yeah.
And it's why our union is so conscious about listening across when we take, like Planned Parenthood mail, as an example. We just stood with Planned Parenthood in the healthcare fight. The Freedom Foundation drops mail in Oregon telling our members that their dues is being used to fund abortions at Planned Parenthood. Because we stand with Planned Parenthood to maintain reproductive choice and access for our members, right? So that is going to intensify as the right wing, gets their $80 million campaign ready to run against every union member when the court makes their decision next year. And so I do think when you ask about this, the decision to redefine, to show up as a union for other communities and then make the case to our members that showing up for it's us we're showing up for, but it's seen in this moment as other communities. People have got to understand it's the way we win and it's the way we realize our vision. And we have to make that case consistently with our members because the opposition against unions is going to intensify in the short term. Right. And the question is, are we going to, I think of it as a family in crisis. And when the family is able to come together and drop all of our shit, excuse my, you know what I mean? And focus, families can make anything happen. We're witnessing it, right? Yeah. In Florida, in Puerto Rico, and the question I think for the union movement is can we behave like that in these I see these next 2 years as make or break. And we are trying, I am not sure environmental, LGBTQ, I don't think the rest of the ecosystem completely understands how at risk our survival is, and that if we can't begin to flip the script in November of 18, we will be a coastal movement on the east and west coasts. And we will probably get reborn in some other way. But I think we have a fighting chance to hold in the Midwest, South, but it's going to be a decision to end the debate on whether we have to recover the white working class and understand the white working class has to understand its future is in a multiracial fight on these other fronts. And we have the privilege of actually having enough relationship and trust to be able to get in the face of the white worker and say, that's wrong, in a way that you don't if you're just knocking on somebody's door for the first time.
It sounds to me like you're talking rebirth in any event, but it's
rebirth, that's right.
It is, but it is, I mean, it is and it isn't. Meaning, if you think about the AFT, not on the what is traditionally viewed as the economic issues, but think about what it's viewed, and I would actually argue, Mary Kay, you do this in terms of all the healthcare issues as well. The advocacy we just did on Medicaid, on ACA,
was not how are we going to maintain health care for our own individual members. The advocacy is how are we going to maintain Medicaid in schools so that kids who have special needs are still going to get their wheelchairs and their feeding tubes, or that kids are going to get nurses who may ultimately become our members or are our members, but that kids have nurses and guidance counselors. The advocacy that our nurses do in hospitals for safe staffing is as much about patient health as it is about their, exhaustion. And this issue about fighting in an authentic way that is believed for the people we serve has been something that actually AFT members and the AFT has had to deal with and confront for the last 20 years, most importantly in the last 10 years, because the fight was Democratic corporatists as well as Republicans who hated public education. But I do think, to Mary Kay's point, and I've said this in speeches, some of you have heard me, we are actually at a historic moment that people will look back and say, what did you do at this moment? I mean, this is a moment of either of a country that can, and I read a lot of history about the 1900s. This is a moment where, as the country just went through 8 years of an African-American president and has gone through democratic changes so that the fastest growing portion of our country will be Latino. We are facing the exploitation of the fear of the other. And this is the moment of, do we show up and fight that? And will that fight be effective and successful? And I think that, I can't talk for Mary Kay, I can only talk for myself, this is animating me more than almost any other moment in my career as an activist or as a trade unionist, because this is the moment that we have to win. Because if we don't win this moment, it's not simply what the labor movement will look at like, it is what will our country look like? What will our democracy look like? And if you listen to Reverend Barber, he talks about the 3 or 4 different moments of Reconstruction, and this is one of them. And so I think that there is a righteous fight we must make now, a moral fight we must make now that transcends any particular grievance. And our job, I think, is how we help create that clarion call with many of the leadership that is here right now and the leaders of our unions.
Okay. Well, whether birth or rebirth, I'm reminded of Lincoln's phrase, a new birth of freedom.
Yep.
And that's certainly what our 2 panelists have been talking about, and so let's give them a round of applause.